The Duke woke up to find a woman lying beside him wearing his shirt, until he learned who she was. Narrated by the Duke's younger brother, Lord Callum Dunrath, in retrospect. I have told this story perhaps a dozen times over the years, to men who could not believe it and women who wept a little when I reached the end. My brother Alastair, the Highland Duke of Dunrath, the man they called the most feared in 4 counties, would, I suspect, prefer I kept it to myself. But he has long since stopped trying to silence me on the subject. He knows, as I do, that some stories deserve to be told. It began on the worst night of October I can remember, the kind of storm that comes off the northern moorland like a deliberate insult, flattening hedgerows and pulling roof slates loose and sending every sensible creature indoors. Alastair had ridden out late. I never did learn what errand had taken him from Dunrath Hall past midnight, and returned drenched to the skin and in no pleasant humor. He told the groom tersely to see to his horse, bypassed the house steward who was waiting with a lamp in the entrance hall, and went straight upstairs to the east wing guest chamber he preferred when he did not wish to be found. He preferred it because no one expected him there. The family rooms were west. The servants knew better than to seek him out after a hard ride. He opened the door, shrugged off his soaking coat, and found a woman asleep in his bed. I was told later by Alastair himself, which is how I know the details he would never confess to anyone else, that his first thought was not fury. His first thought, he said, was that she was the most quietly dignified-looking creature he had ever seen unconscious, which he recognized immediately as an absurd thing to think and chose not to examine. She lay on top of the covers, fully clothed in, and here is where the story becomes the story. One of his own spare shirts, which she had apparently found in the trunk at the foot of the bed, and pulled on over her ruined gown because her outer layers were hanging, soaked through, from the dressing chair by the fire. The fire, I should add, she had lit herself. She had found the flint box on the mantel, struck it competently, and built a small but respectable blaze. This was not the behavior of a woman who had wandered in by accident and lost her nerve. Alastair stood in the doorway for a moment that he describes as considerable. Then he closed the door behind him, crossed to the chair nearest the fire, sat down, and waited. She woke perhaps 20 minutes later. I know what most men would have done in that situation. I know what most men of Alastair's rank and temper would have done: shouted for the footman, demanded an explanation at volume, frightened the creature half to death, and then had her turned out into the storm regardless. My brother is not most men. He is not a gentle man or an easy one, but he has a code, and part of that code, which I watched him hold to across 30 years of difficult circumstances, is that he does not raise his voice at a woman who has not yet been given the chance to speak. She opened her eyes, took in the room in one calm sweep, the fire, the window black with rain, the man in the chair watching her, and sat up without scrambling, without the fluster and the cry of alarm that anyone could have excused. She simply sat up, arranged the overlarge shirt across her lap with something approaching composure, and looked at him. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You owe me several," Alastair said. "I will give them all," she said, "if you will allow me to do so in order rather than all at once. I think that will serve us both better." He told me afterward that he almost smiled. He did not, but almost. Her name was Miss Cecily Vane. Her father had been Lord Vane of Carrowdale, the small estate that abutted the Dunrath land to the south, separated from it by the river and a line of hawthorn hedging that both families had maintained for 3 generations. Lord Vane had died 14 months earlier, leaving debts that Cecily had not known the full scope of until the solicitors arrived. The estate was lost. The house was sold. What remained had been claimed against the debts, legally and without mercy, by a consortium of creditors whose agent, a man named Prewitt, hard-eyed and efficient, had been pursuing her across the county for 6 weeks with a document she had refused to sign. The document, she explained quietly, was a transfer of her person, not in those words. In the words of a contract for marriage, drawn up between the lead creditor and a business associate of his who had expressed interest in acquiring a titled gentleman's daughter for a wife. The debt would be forgiven. She would be delivered. "Delivered," Alastair repeated. "That was the word Mr. Prewitt used," she said. "I found it clarifying." She had been traveling to her only living relative, a grey-tant in the village of Glassick, some 40 miles north, with a single bag and a hired cart whose driver had turned back when the storm broke. She had seen the lights of Dunrath Hall through the rain. She had known, she said, that the Duke of Dunrath would not be in residence. Everyone in the county knew he kept to his Edinburgh townhouse through October, and she had hoped to shelter in an outbuilding or perhaps a corridor until morning. The unlocked side door and the unoccupied-looking east wing had been, she acknowledged, a temptation she had given into more thoroughly than she had intended. "I found the shirt," she said with the first small crack in her composure, "because I was genuinely afraid I would take ill if I stayed in wet things and I could not afford to be ill. I apologize for it. I will replace it." Alistair looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the glass. "Lord Vane's daughter," he said. "Yes." He had known her father. Not well, they had not been close neighbors in the social sense, the estates touching but the families running in different circles, but he had known him well enough. A quiet man. A man of honor, everyone said. A man who had, apparently, been very bad with money or very badly used by people who were good at pretending to help. "Carrowdale," Alistair said. "The South Pasture land, the Ridge Road, the mill on the Dunrath stream." "All sold," she said. "Yes. I saw those fields from my own window for 20 years. I grew up in them," she said. And then, because she was clearly not a woman who permitted herself to dwell on what she had said when it showed too much, she looked away toward the fire. Alistair did not send her away. He did not, I should clarify, act out of sentiment, or not primarily. What he did because the thing Pruitt was doing was wrong in a way that Alistair recognized clearly and immediately. The kind of wrong that well-dressed men in cities arranged for one another using legal documents so that it looked like commerce rather than what it was. He had seen it before. He had stepped across the room from it before when he could. He stepped across the room from it now. He gave Miss Vane the guest chamber for the night. He gave her the room properly, called the housekeeper, had a supper tray sent up, had her wet garments dried and returned by morning. He moved himself without ceremony to the West family wing where he was supposed to be. And he sent, before he went to bed, a very short note to his solicitor in the village, to be delivered the moment the roads were passable. He did not tell Miss Vane what was in the note. He barely spoke to her the following morning beyond the courtesies of breakfast, which she took in the small dining room with the housekeeper present, as was proper. She was composed and quiet, and thanked him for his hospitality in a manner that made clear she expected nothing more than to leave that morning, which she fully intended to do. "The roads are still bad," Alistair said. "I will manage," she said. "You will not," he said, and something in the flatness of it made her look up. "Pruitt and his men were at the village inn last night. My groom passed them on his way back from the farrier. They are waiting for the storm to clear." She said nothing for a moment, then, "I see." "Stay," Alistair said. "One more day." She stayed. The one more day became 3. Because Alistair's solicitor turned out to require 2 days to assemble what Alistair had asked him to assemble, which was, in brief, a legal review of the entire debt consortium, a detailed accounting of every instrument used against the Vane estate, and an opinion on the validity of the marriage transfer document. What the solicitor found, and communicated in a letter that arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, made Alistair very still and very quiet in a way that I know from long experience means he is deciding something. One of the creditors, the lead one, the man behind Pruitt, had been among the group who'd counseled Lord Vane in his last years on a series of investments. The investments had been designed to fail. The debt had not been inherited exactly. It had been manufactured, slowly and legally, from the inside. Cecily did not know this. She knew her father had been in debt. She did not know why or at whose direction. Alistair sat across from her that evening in the drawing room, the housekeeper again present, propriety again observed and told her, directly without softening it in ways that would have been condescending. He said, "Here is what was done to your father, and here is by whom, and here is what the document they are asking you to sign is actually worth in law, which is considerably less than Mr. Pruitt would have you believe." She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, there was a silence. "They murdered him," she said quietly, not with heat, with the specific, cold clarity of a woman who has turned a thing over and finally seen its true shape. "Not with their hands, but they did." "Yes," Alistair said. "And the document is, in my solicitor's opinion, challengeable on 3 grounds. It was signed under coercion, the debt upon which it rests is tainted, and the transfer itself is, to put it in plain terms, Not a thing the law allows in the way Pruitt has written it. Then I am not obligated. You were never obligated, Alastair said, but now you have paper that says so. Pruitt came to Dunrath Hall on the morning of the 4th day. I was there for this part. I had ridden up from my own house at Alastair's request. He had sent a brief note which said, "Only come if you can. There is a thing you ought to see," and arrived just in time to watch it unfold in the entrance hall, which Alastair had chosen deliberately. Not the study, where such things were usually handled. The entrance hall, where the housekeeper and both footmen and the steward, and the groom who had come up from the stables were all, by complete coincidence, present. Pruitt was a compact, neat man with a city solicitor's manner and the eyes of someone accustomed to being underestimated by the people he was pressing. He had 2 men with him. He announced himself to the steward, stated his business. He was seeking a Miss Vane, who was believed to be on these premises in connection with a legal matter, and was shown in. Alastair was standing at the foot of the stairs. Cecily was standing beside him, not behind him, beside him. She had been told that morning what he intended to do. She had looked at him for a long moment and said, "You don't have to," and he had said, "I know," and she had lifted her chin and said, "Then yes," and that in its entirety was the conversation that preceded what came next. Pruitt saw her immediately and began to speak. He said her name and the name of the creditor he represented, and began to describe, in the pleasantly opaque language of a man used to making illegal things sound administrative, the matter of the outstanding instrument. Alastair let him finish. Then he said, in the voice he uses when he has already decided and is simply communicating the outcome, "Miss Vane is under my protection." Pruitt blinked. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Your Grace." "I have found," Alastair said, "no ambiguity in the statement. Miss Vane is under my protection. The document you are carrying has been reviewed by my solicitor and has been found to be without legal standing. Your employer in the matter of the Vane estate will be hearing from my man of business by the end of the week. In the meantime, you and your companions will leave these premises. Your Grace, the matter of the debt is not your matter any longer," Alastair said. "It is mine." There was a silence. Pruitt looked at Cecily. Cecily looked back at him with an expression I can only describe as the particular stillness of a woman who has decided she will not be afraid anymore. She did not move. She did not look away. She simply stood there in Dunrath Hall beside my brother and waited. Pruitt left. I walked with Alastair in the garden afterward while Cecily rested. The strain of the morning had been considerable, and she had borne it without yielding an inch, but she was human and she was tired. The storm had passed entirely. The northern moorland was all gold and gray under a cold October sun, the kind of day that makes you feel the landscape has been scrubbed clean. "Well," I said. "Don't," Alastair said. "I was going to say it was well handled." "You were going to say a great deal more than that." He was right, I was, but I had the sense to let the morning sit for a little while. We walked in silence for a time along the ridge path, and I looked south toward where the Vane fields were brown and still now, the mill visible through bare trees along the stream bank, and I thought about the 20 years Alastair had looked at those fields from this same path and never once spoken of them to me. "She grew up in those fields," I said. "Yes," Alastair said. I let another silence pass. "What do you intend?" I asked. Alastair was quiet for a moment. He had his hands behind his back, in the way he has when he is thinking clearly and has no particular need to perform anything for anyone. "I intend," he said, "to see that Carrowdale is restored as far as it can be. The debt was manufactured. The law can unwind manufactured debts, given sufficient time and a competent solicitor. I intend to provide both." "And Miss Vane will go to her great-aunt in Glassick," he said, "when she chooses to, or she will stay if she chooses to stay. She does not lack for choices anymore." "That is very considerate of you," I said. He looked at me sidelong. He has a way of doing this, a look that suggests he is aware of exactly what I am implying and is choosing, as a courtesy to me, not to dismantle it publicly. "I admired her father," he said after a moment. "He was a good man in a county that had too few of them." "Yes," I said. Another silence. "She is like him," Alastair said. "In that quality, that particular quality of not yielding on the things that matter and not making a performance of it. He had that. I noticed it in him years ago. You noticed it in her rather more recently, I said. Callum, he said. I am simply observing, I said. He said nothing further, but I noticed, when we turned back toward the house, that his pace slowed slightly as Dunrath Hall came into view, as if he was in no particular hurry to reach it, but was in no particular hurry to leave it either. I recognized that. I had not seen it in him before. Cecily Vane did not go to Glassick. Not that autumn, not the following spring. She stayed at Dunrath Hall at Alastair's invitation, and with the full propriety of a companion for her in the form of the elderly Lady Marchmont, a neighbor of ours who found the arrangement perfectly sensible and said so to everyone who asked, which was everyone. The county talked. The county was welcome to. What happened between them in the months that followed I can tell you only in outline, because I was not present for most of it, and Alastair is not a man who narrates his own interior life without considerable prompting. I know they argued, at least twice. Alastair arguing with a woman of spirit is something I once believed impossible, because the women of spirit generally retreated, and the women who did not retreat generally did not have spirit, merely stubbornness. Cecily had both and retreated from neither, and I am told that the second argument, which concerned the question of what she was to do with her life, and what he thought she ought to do with it, ended with him saying something he had not planned to say and her being very still for a long time, and then saying something back that he also had not expected. I was told this by Mrs. Farrow, the housekeeper, who I recognize is not a strictly neutral source. I was present for the proposal. It was not the public grand gesture that some would have expected from the Highland Duke of Dunrath. That is not his manner, and it would not have suited her. It was in the library, on a gray February morning, with the fire going and no one else in the room, and he stood up from his chair when she came in and said her name, simply her name, Cecily, and then said what he had to say. I was told this by Cecily herself later, when she was comfortable enough in her happiness to tell me things, because she said I deserved to know how it ended given that I had seen the beginning. She said yes. I was at the wedding. Of course I was. I am his brother, and I had, I think, earned it. The church at Dunrath Village was full, because the county that had talked about them all winter was not about to miss the conclusion. Lady Marchmont sat in the second row and wept tidily into a handkerchief. Prewitt's employer, who had received Alastair's man of business's letter and found it as unpleasant as it was intended to be, did not attend. He sent his regrets through a third party. He was not missed. Cecily wore cream silk, not white, because she said cream suited the northern light better, and she would not wear a color she did not like simply because it was expected. This was, in retrospect, a very Cecily thing to say. She came up the aisle on her own, there was no male relation to take her arm, and she walked the way she did everything, at her own pace, with her chin at the precise angle that said she had considered and chosen and was not uncertain. Alastair watched her come. I watched Alastair. He has a face that most people in the county would describe as unreadable, and they are not wrong, exactly. He has worn that face for 30 years in ballrooms and business dealings and disputes with difficult men, and all the other occasions that required him to be the Highland Duke of Dunrath. I know it as well as I know my own reflection. What was on his face when Cecily walked toward him was not that face. It was something I had not seen on him before, something that required no translation. She reached him, he took her hand. The vicar began. I have told this story a dozen times, as I said. Men who cannot believe it, women who weep a little. What they are responding to, I think, what catches somewhere behind the ribs when you hear it, is not the drama of Prewitt being turned out, or the discovery of the manufactured debt, or the legal victory, satisfying as all of those were. It is the smaller thing. The woman who woke up in a strange room in a man's shirt and sat up without scrambling and said, I owe you an explanation, who stood beside the most feared duke in 4 counties in his own entrance hall and did not look away. And the man who, for perhaps the first time in his life, did not want to be looked away from. That is the story of how Cecily Vane came to be the Duchess of Dunrath. She arrived in the middle of a storm, wearing his shirt, and she never fully left. He has never, as far as I can tell, wanted her to,